This week on Quality Digest Live, we look at risk-based thinking and ISO 9001 with Chad Kymal of Omnex Systems.
Plus, can too much knowledge kill innovation? We'll find out when we come back.
This episode of Quality Digest Live is sponsored by Hexagon Metrology. Hexagon carries the widest range of quality brands. With its extensive support network, Hexagon is also your partner. Hexagon Metrology. We are metrology.
Welcome back to Quality Digest Live for August 21st, 2015. QDL is your weekly look at who and what is making the news in the world of quality. I'm Mike Richmond, publisher of Quality Digest.
And I'm Quality Digest Editor-in-Chief, Dr. Sharm. So you're familiar with have you ever watched Mythbusters?
Oh, sure, Mythbusters, yep.
Okay, sure. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a Discovery Channel show that, if you don't know about it, that tackles urban myths and improbable movie stunts and similar things and puts them to the test.
And blows stuff up.
And, of course,
blows a lot of stuff up.
Blows a lot of stuff up. That's the best part of the show.
Great show.
Well, perhaps spurred by an episode of Mythbusters that looked at what was more energy efficient, driving with the AC on or driving with the AC off and the windows down, SAE did a very in-depth analysis of that very same question. And the result, they agreed with Mythbusters that windows down is more energy efficient. Sometimes. It kind of depends.
Right.
First, it's not exactly as obvious a question as it seems. Remember, a rolled down window creates drag. So one of the questions is, does the amount of drag caused by an open window or windows more than eat up the amount of energy saved by not running the AC? Well, it turns out that it all depends on the vehicle, the speed you're traveling, the ambient temperature, and a whole bunch of other stuff. In SAE's experiments, it turned out that in one particular model of four-door sedan, traveling at 50 miles per hour, having the windows down and the AC off used more energy than having the windows up and the AC set on recirculate and a low fan setting. So minimum AC. Now that tended to be the exception to the rule. In general, running your AC does use more energy than just using your windows, which, you know, it's kind of obvious, but not in all circumstances. So I just thought it was interesting that sometimes the most obvious thing, we always kind of jump to the obvious. Well, of course, you know, AC is going to be the biggest energy user. And I think it's interesting because it kind of raises, it makes us, this kind of thing, I think, makes us look a little bit more in depth at any kind of question. Sometimes the obvious answer is true most of the time, but very often there's exceptions to it. And I thought that was kind of an interesting little science experiment.
Yeah, that SAE did there, kind of in the realm of Mythbusters there too.
Right.
But yeah, it was very narrow set of circumstances here. It wasn't really general that the AC was a better use. Sometimes it was, like you see, sometimes it wasn't. It was a very specific set of circumstances.
Yeah, you could create a circumstances where having your windows down actually used more gas than turning the AC on.
Yeah, turning the AC on. Interesting stuff. Who knew? Well, that's great. Thanks.
That's all I got.
There you go. Thanks, Dirk. All right. Well, that story was speaking about efficiency. And speaking about efficiency, another news item that caught our eye this week addressed the very same issue from the perspective of workers at the workplace. It came to us from a pair of little-known media outlets called the New York Times and Yahoo News. But our crack, sharp-eyed editorial team uncovered those stories nonetheless. It's hard, you know. I mean, these small little, there's a lot of small media like that out there these days. So it's tough to keep on top of them all. Well, the original piece, Inside Amazon, Wrestling Big Ideas in a Bruising Workplace, appeared on the Times site on August 15th. That article was then referenced in a Yahoo News item, Amazon's data-driven approach becoming more common. That ran on Monday, and we linked out to it in yesterday's issue of Quality Digest Daily. So it's kind of a string of links and references there. But Times last weekend, Yahoo ran a piece on Monday, which we linked out to in Thursday's Quality Digest Daily, so all of you could see it if you missed it. Now, the Times piece, again back last weekend, really took Amazon to task for a lot of sins. There's a lot of interviews with ex-Amazonians in that piece. Most of those revolved around how poorly they appear, and I don't want to say that this is definitely going on, but I mean it's what the contents the comments were, how poorly they appear to treat their workers, their workforce within that bruising workplace, as they call it. The key nugget in all of this, which the Yahoo story focused on, was Amazon's use of mountains, oceans, planets, galaxies of data to ensure the absolutely highest possible levels of workplace productivity. In many cases, the data was used to play employees and teams off one another in kind of a Darwinian survival of the fittest race to maximize not only productivity, but innovation too. And other large companies are really beginning to take up these tactics too. And some of this was really interesting, the way that Amazon does is there's a lot of anonymous feedback that employees can give to management about other employees. So, you're in a very competitive environment and you have employees saying, well, Joe took like a 4-hour break last week and he'd missed out on this project and we're teammates on this project, but really I did all the work on it. I mean, you can see how this is rife for backstabbing and problems.
Well, and not only that, I think also part of this data is also customer feedback data and all that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, it's a lot of. I don't want to minimize. It's a lot of data, and the data, it does a lot of things, but it's really intended to analyze. It's intended to analyze how well those workers do what they're doing. So when I read the stories, all I could think about was big data meets scientific management, right? I mean, I'm sure that Frederick Winslow Taylor, 100 and some odd years ago, would have just loved to have access to all that information. And for sure, I think he would have employed all those little details to their utmost use and squeezed every last little drop of effort out of every single one of those workers. And one might argue,
sure,
what's wrong with that, right? I mean, short of discrimination, which Amazon has largely not, I want to make this clear, Amazon has not been accused of discrimination in almost any cases. There's nothing illegal about a very demanding workplace. I mean, we're all in business to succeed, and if we can use data to give us the best possible chance of success, even at the expense of workers' feelings, and maybe even at the expense of any semblance of work-life balance for those workers, well, we could and should do it, right?
But I think Bezos even said
it's not our culture.
Yeah.
He said that's not the Amazon I know.
Well, but he has said in the past that, look, we have a very demanding workplace, and words even stronger than that. I mean, he's pretty much admitted up front that, this is a
tough place to work.
Tough place to work.
And he says that in the article. He said, I've interviewed many people who have said, this is a very tough place to work. Be ready for that. So, but then on the other hand, I mean, aren't corporations people? Really? I mean, I don't mean that in the political Citizens United sense, but in the most basic interpretation possible. Corporations are made up of people, and sometimes there's tens of thousands of people, and the culture of a company in terms of how it treats its own people is every bit as important, I think, as the culture in terms of how it treats its customers. You can't have one without the other, or you can't have one without the other if you have ethics. So is Amazon at bottom an ethical company? To be honest, I really don't know. And these articles don't really tell you. They look at it from a couple of different ways. But it's a fascinating look at the question and an important reminder that big data, it's kind of like fire. I mean, it can be used as a tool for good. It can be used as a tool for evil. It's just how you use it. And it's interesting, though, that big data is being used in these ways to very closely monitor and measure workers. And again, harkening back to Frederick Winslow Taylor, scientific management, getting as much productivity as you can out of those workers.
Well, I like what you said at the end there. Data is just a tool.
Yeah.
And what you do with it is up to you, and it could be abused. And matter of fact, and I believe in one of those articles they did actually talk about how the data was used in a positive way. Data kind of pointed out that there were women employees were having problems in a particular department, and when they looked into it, they were like overworked. I mean, they had way more responsibilities and things that they had to get done than they had the personnel for, and it helped them to staff up. So I mean, that's the flip side of it. Is if you don't have this data, you don't know this kind of stuff. So,
but Amazon has had problems. Let's be honest. Amazon has had notable instances where they haven't treated their employees real well. I mean, I heard a joke the other day about Amazon, which I'm going to tell because it's funny, where the workers were really happy. The workers in the warehouses were really happy that robots were being brought into the workplace. Because now, because the robots need AC, the management had to put AC into the warehouses.
Got to keep the robots.
Got to keep those robots happy, right? I mean, you can't have them go down. So that was kind of an apocryphal maybe story, or maybe it's true, but it's pretty interesting that that's the culture over at Amazon.
All right. Well, mention ISO 9001 2015, the new version of ISO 9001 one due out most likely in October. And people who are involved in the standard will have some pretty strong opinions and concerns. And the concerns typically revolve around a few things. At least this is what we keep hearing come up, and that's documentation. How are we, what are we, there's been changes in documentation. What do we do with that? The management rep, or lack of, and having a risk-based approach to your QMS. And the term risk looms large in the new version of the standard, and many people either aren't sure what exactly that means, or how they are to address risk, or perhaps more important to a lot of people, what are auditors going to look for when it comes to determining whether you are meeting the standards requirements when it comes to addressing risk. So on the show with us today to shed a little light on the subject, hopefully, is Chad Kymal, author of this week's article, Risk-Based Thinking and ISO 9001:2015. Chad is also Chief Technology Officer and founder of Omnex Incorporated, an international consulting and training organization. Hi, Chad. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, Dirk.
Hey.
Glad to be here.
Well, thanks. So let's just kind of get this up front. In a nutshell, what is your interpretation of how ISO 9001:2015 defines risk?
Excellent question, Dirk. And let me just tell all the listeners that there has been a change. So the standard now defines, the FDIS defines risk as the effect of uncertainty. That's it. The old one said the effect of uncertainty on an expected result. So, well, not such a big change, except the standard has become more general in nature. Then when you also look inside it, there's actually 6 notes, and I'll just tell you consistently, that it's potential, we know already, that there's uncertainty and lack of information or knowledge. It's not going to concern us too much. But for those of us trying to implement it, it is key to understand that the typical understanding of risk is that it has a consequence. Let me talk about the consequence first. Consequence in 14001 called the impact. And if you use FMEA terminology, there's an effect and a severity, right? And then there's a likelihood, a probability of occurrence. So in a nutshell, that's risk. It's the effect of uncertainty.
Okay, so that sounds like there's a lot of different things going on with that. So I don't know, in your opinion, what does the standard require when it comes to risk? And I guess it's a standard. They're going to require some sort of documentation. What is it that you're going to need to do to show that you're meeting the requirements, such as they are? It sounds a little nebulous to me, but I'm not in this field, so.
Absolutely, it is very general. Thus, allowing, for folks to implement it in any different way. So, what can we say about risk? Or take a look at the article I have, and then, of course, I'm going to talk more about this in the webinar coming up. Risk shows up 8 times in the standard, and risk-based thinking, well, I'm going to talk about risk-based thinking and the impact of risk-based thinking also in the webinar. But I'll stick to risk. And really, 2 big parts in terms of risk. One is, how do you consider risk in planning? So to make it easier to understand, I'll just say risk when you set your goals and objectives and your actions for improvement. So 6.0 planning. And in that planning, they expect you to bring in the QMS processes, or the process map of the company, the business process risk. I'll just stick to QMS processes just to keep to the standard. And second, we need to think about the context and the interested parties. So that's going to be the challenge for people in understanding how to bring in the QMS processes, the context, and the interested parties' expectations into the planning when you set, the overall goals and objectives for the company. The second part of it is actually very broad. It's actually in the requirements for 5.1.2, which is customer focused, and it says that risk and opportunities can affect the conformity of products and services. And so, really, wide open for people to interpret, but really, that's all the standard says.
Well, I mean, I guess the point I'm getting at is, do we have any idea how auditors might audit a company for its risk approach and assessment? So I mean, if I was a listener out there right now and I'm listening to this, I'm going, okay, so risk, I kind of get what you're saying. Mm-hmm. What in the heck am I going to be showing an auditor?
So let me just also say this, Dirk. You know, when you ask me the standard, I have to be general. So when you talk about, so you ask me what do the standards say and what does the standard require, I had to be very general and say, hey, there's really two places where you have to set up your risk. One in planning, one very broad, products and services. So companies have to decide for themselves how you're going to tackle it, what specific way you're going to do it. Though the standard doesn't require any specific way, at the end of the day, the company has to decide what to do. But let's talk a little bit about what auditors may or may not do. So how do you audit risk? Number one, the auditors have to be flexible. They have to understand that the standard is very general, and they have to go in with that mindset and see what the organization has done. What has the organization done in terms of the internal, external issues of the context? From the context, you're supposed to come up with internal, external issues that affect the business. How did they bring that into the planning? How did they bring in interested party expectations into the planning? And number three, using this, how did they identify the risks and the associated opportunities? And then, how did they, in 6.1.2, when they set up the actions, how did they set up the improvement actions? I'll say that, really, the auditor, if you're teaching auditors, we have to teach them to be open, accepting. Of course, what will we not accept? What will be a non-conformance is if you haven't done a good job with your context, you haven't identified your issues, internal, external, you haven't analyzed interested party expectations. Three, you haven't brought that into the planning. And number four, that the QMS process risk hasn't been considered as they look in terms of the overall risks of the company. And have you done that, number one? And number two, have you got good improvement actions that, will reduce the risk and, significantly improve the I brought that word in significantly. So I want to be very careful, what I say. Make sure there's enough opportunity and overall improvement in the company. Really, that's what we can say. And, as you can imagine, what we'll do, when I say something general like that, that's really what auditors have to learn. But we'll try to encapsulate it by a series of questions we can help auditors ask. And, I published a book on how to audit in 9001-2008. I'm right now working on an update to that by ASQ in 9001-2015. And of course, for all the listeners, I'll be talking much more about it. I think I have an hour, if I'm not mistaken, Dirk,
right.
in the webinar.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll be able to get into a lot more of these, delve into this a little bit more deeply during that webinar, and you'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit more. I just want to remind people that this webinar is coming up. It's next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific,
2 p.m. Eastern.
And 2 p.m. Eastern. That's Tuesday, August 25th. See it on your slide there. The title says it all, ISO 9001 FDIS. That's the final draft international standard for risk-based ISO 9000 FDIS, and this is going to be on risk-based thinking, actions to address risks and opportunities. And Chad's going to be the presenter on that, and I will be there hosting and taking your questions and flinging them Chad's way. Chad, thanks for joining us this morning, and we will see you on Tuesday, right?
Absolutely, Dirk. And I just want to leave the listeners with just a couple of snippets. I'll be able to bring in more. I'll talk about risk-based thinking. I'll tell you what that means to the overall equation. Why do we always refer to risk and opportunities? I'll talk to you more about that. And of course, I would be, if I didn't tell you about specific techniques, I would not be doing, justice to what we have to do. So all those and more. And thank you very much, Dirk.
Okay. Thanks, Chad. Thanks for joining us this morning.
We'll see you on Tuesday.
Okay.
Thank you. And for all, thanks. For all of you out there who want to register to that webinar, you can check out Chad's article right below the player page down there. There's a link out to it, and keep an eye on your email as well. We'll be emailing you for more information about that early next week. Okay. Well, moving on. Innovation Decreases with Knowledge by Jeffrey Phillips appeared in yesterday's issue of Quality Digest Daily. Interesting article there, as you can see it. Yes, that appeared yesterday in Quality Digest Daily. And Phillips is an innovation consultant, and he helps his clients with idea generation and breakthrough thinking. That's what innovation is all about, right? The title of the piece, as he points out, does not mean that he believes that dumb people make better innovators. He's not saying innovation decreases with knowledge. It's not what he's saying. To get what he is saying, you have to, I think, have the proper definition of the term knowledge. In this context, knowledge has nothing to do with intelligence. Instead, it's really kind of a wisdom or an insight that you gain through experience, meaning repeated exposure to something. The more you're exposed to something, the more experience you have, the more knowledge you have. But as Phillips points out, that repeated exposure to something, that knowledge will lead to something else that's in quote marks now, expertise, which again sounds maybe better than it is unless you look at it in context, at least as it's applied to innovation. See, those with knowledge and expertise, when faced with a problem, are naturally going to gravitate towards solving that problem in ways that have worked for them in the past. It's kind of an anti-innovation, right? Instead, what Phillips recommends is that you see the problem with what's known as beginner's mind, and that's an interesting term. It really allows you to see the problem through the eyes of a child, because kids don't have preconceived notions, they don't have knowledge, they don't have expertise in most cases. What they do have is they have the ability to look at something with fresh eyes, with innocence. What children are really great at is asking the 5 whys. Geez, children are great at asking the 10 whys, 20 whys,
yeah, exactly.
And that's what kids do. They ask why a lot, and they don't necessarily say, well, gosh, we can't do it that way. This problem needs to be solved in a certain way. They look at it and say it's a problem. I mean, we can do anything we want, right? We're people, so we're going to look at it, and that's what kids do. So what Phillips suggests in his piece is that you take that beginner's mindset when you need to have an innovative breakthrough on a problem or question that you're having, and bring that to your organization. Foster that in your entire organization. Don't rely on people. Everybody in organizations has some level of expertise, and we all love to rely on it. We all love to say, well, I know how to do that. I'm going to do that. But what Phillips is saying is, try to get away from that if you can. When you have an innovative problem you need to solve in an innovative way, bring beginner's mind to it. Don't assume you know what's going to happen. Throw that out pretty much and look at it with fresh eyes.
Does he mean, that would be hard to do it if we already have knowledge. Does he mean like bringing in people who aren't familiar with the problem? Because I think it would be hard for you to do that yourself if you've already got a lot of knowledge.
Yeah, partially, but he's also saying that those of us who do have the knowledge and experience need to choke that down. I mean, you can choke it down a little bit if you're conscious of it. If you're saying, well, gosh, I've always done it this way. In the past, I had this experience. As soon as you start going down that road, stop and say, all right, well, I did do that. I'm kind of reading into it a little bit here to answer your question. I did do it that way, but maybe I should not even think about that. Maybe I should try to engage with people, because what happens is you engage with people and you start dragging the conversation back to what you know. So don't do that. Let other people who have different experiences maybe bring it in their direction. Maybe you can try to get them away from their experiences, and maybe in that way you can get more innovation into the system. Beginner's mind is what he's talking about here.
Well,
it's hard. It's not easy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we could probably worth spending a couple of minutes talking about this, is I'm guessing one thing that you could do is take ideas from other people, and rather than, it's almost like brainstorming, right? Is you have all this knowledge, and people are saying, well, why don't you try it this way? And you're already in the back of your head going, well, no, I've got enough knowledge, but I just know that won't work. Well, maybe you set that aside.
Yeah, you do.
And you go, okay, well, let's take a nugget of what this suggestion is and just massage that a little bit, because maybe the way this person who's not familiar with the process, maybe the way they're presenting it won't work, but maybe there's something there that will allow me to allow us to go off on a completely another direction that would be different from the traditional way that we've approached the problem.
Exactly. It's funny, you ask about how you can have other people look at the problem outside of the ones that have experience. He does actually say, maybe we're not taking advantage of our bring your kids to work days. Maybe we should have these kids get into a conference room and start brainstorming. Well, here's what we're dealing with right now. What do you think of kind of a cute little idea, but that's what he's talking about is looking at it from that perspective. But yeah, I mean, you're going to be limited many times in the resources you have. You have to use the team you got, but try to break out of it is what he's saying. Just be conscious of it.
Well,
really the key thing.
There was another article this week that in some ways touches on that, and we won't get into it in depth right now, but it had to do with what we call soul sourcing, and many of you are familiar with soul sourcing. It's the idea that traditionally, or the kind of the conventional wisdom is, you don't want to do it. You don't want to have a single vendor for a particular, let's say, component that goes into your product. You don't want to do that because there's risks associated with that, right? If they're your sole vendor and they have a fire at their plant, well, where does that leave you, right? Or sometimes there's quality. If all of a sudden you have quality or delivery problems and they're your only vendor for that particular part, well, now it's like, well, I got to go search for another vendor, or I've got to wait for them to deal with their issues or whatever. So the traditional thinking is that you don't do that, right? So that's kind of the traditional approach. The knowledge approach is like, oh, we all know you don't do that. Well, an interesting article this week by Shuo Wang, he's talking about, he kind of flips it on his head, and he says, well, think about this from another direction. Think about the positives that come out of think about the positives that come out of sole sourcing. And he talked about this in the case for single source procurement. And basically what he's saying there is like, look, yeah, there's some negatives, but there are positives. And basically the positives come about from changing your mindset on what a vendor is. Right. The Chinese and the Asian culture have a much different relationship with vendors. They really see it as literally as a relationship, capital R. The Western idea of a business relationship isn't much of a relationship. I mean, if you think about it, it's a relationship up to a point, and then if there's any problems, it's kind of like, well, you're on your own, we're going to go elsewhere. Particular Chinese vendors, and this is an article from an outsourcing company, they look at more at how do you nurture that relationship and work through the problems with a vendor, whether it's a quality problem, a delivery problem, any kind of problem, or even if there is even if there's a catastrophe at a plant, let's say a tsunami in Japan and your plant goes down. How do you build those relationships such that you have something stronger than what you would have if you had multiple vendors? And the tsunami one is a good example. Shuo Wang, in the article, not in the article, but in a separate conversation I had with him, talks about there were vendors, there were buyers in the United States who had vendors in Japan after the tsunami who did not have procurement problems. The reason they didn't is because the relationships were so tight with those particular vendors that were hurt, that those vendors gave them preference on getting product out. I mean, because everybody was in a scramble to ramp up, right? Well, which buyers got the best service?
Sure.
Those who had maintained a relationship with the vendor, who had a strong working relationship with the vendor, they were given preference and even access to stock that nobody else had access to because of that relationship. So the relationship idea is really, really strong.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It ties back with the idea of risk we talked about earlier in the show too, with Chad. This idea that one of the things about risk is you try to cover your bases in case anything were to happen. And not going with a single source supplier is one way that many people deal with risk. They say,
Exactly,
well,
yeah.
if there's a tsunami in Asia, I want to have a supplier as well in Brazil,
Right.
to cover that and to smooth out the risk. But what you're saying here is that there's different ways of looking at that risk, and that maybe there's a risk as well of having multiple sources, whereas the stronger relationship with the one source maybe accounts for making up for some of that risk. It's interesting to look at it from that perspective as well.
And some of his arguments, I got to say, some of his arguments are a little weak, but it's actually worth reading through it because he talks about some of the weaknesses in multi-sourcing as well, and there are weaknesses.
There are weaknesses there too.
And matter of fact, he points out some of the things that you think you're tackling, having multiple vendors, you aren't really tackling the issue. I mean, you're just kind of spreading things around a little bit, but you still have the same problem. This is now you have it with multiple vendors instead of just one vendor.
Yeah,
so
interesting.
anyway, take a look at that article. I think if you're a procurement person, a buyer, a purchasing person, I think it's an interesting article to look at. Some of his arguments are a little weak, but he actually makes some interesting points here, particularly when it comes to relationships. So.
No doubt. Good article. A bunch of good articles this week that we had in QDD. All right, well, that's our show this week. But before we wrap it up, we'd like to give thanks to today's sponsor. Hexagon Metrology is committed to helping you control your processes, enhance the quality of your products, and increase efficiencies. They empower you to stay one step ahead of a changing world with their wide range of product offerings, nearly 200 years of expertise, and an extensive support network. Hexagon Metrology, where quality comes together. For more information, just click on the banner ad just below or just to the right of this video player screen.
That's right. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to Chad Kymal from Omnex to give us kind of a teaser of what we can expect next week in the webinar. So if you're interested in ISO 9001 2015, maybe you're currently registered and are looking at transitioning to the new version, or maybe ISO 9001 is all new to you. You'll want to take a look at this webinar, ISO 9001 FDIS, Risk-Based Thinking, Actions to Address Risks and Opportunities. Risks and opportunities. We're going to talk about that a little bit. That's kind of a confusing term for some people. Next Tuesday, 11 a.m. Pacific, whatever that is.
2 p.m. Eastern.
2 p.m.
That's right.
Do my little time math there.
That's right. That's right. And yeah, again, check out the article right below the player page, Chad's article that he co-wrote. You can link out to the webinar registration page there. Keep an eye on your inbox as well, because we'll be emailing you again with a final reminder on that early next week.
That's it.
All right, well, that's our show. Well, thanks all for joining us. Thank you again, Chad, all the authors who contributed. Thank you all for being here. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.
So long.
Bye.